Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a lost city beneath the waves. It's a story about us, about the cities we're building right now at this very moment, and the patterns we're repeating without even realizing it. This is about the ghost that haunts every skyscraper, every subway system, every gleaming metropolitan skyline from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. The ghost of civilizations that believed they were invincible, that thought their engineering could conquer nature, that assumed their prosperity would last forever. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about progress, about civilization, about the safety of the urban world we've constructed. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: we are living inside the greatest urban experiment in human history, and the early results suggest we may be repeating mistakes that have destroyed societies for thousands of years. The stakes couldn't be higher. More than half of humanity now lives in cities. 4 billion souls packed into urban centers that consume 3/4 of the world's resources and produce 80% of global GDP. These cities are magnificent, yes, breathtaking monuments to human ambition, but they are also fragile in ways we're only beginning to understand. They depend on systems so complex, so interconnected, that a single failure can cascade into catastrophe. They strain against environmental limits that ancient civilizations once crossed, with consequences we're still uncovering in archaeological ruins. Tonight, we're going to trace a pattern that stretches from the oldest urban centers of Mesopotamia to the megacities of today. We'll walk through the ruins of societies that believed they had conquered the fundamental challenges of urban life, only to watch their cities crumble. And we'll confront the unsettling question: are we different? Or are we simply the latest chapter in a story that always ends the same way? Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know and ensures you won't miss future explorations into history's deepest mysteries and most urgent warnings. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this global community come together to wrestle with these questions. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there were no cities. For 99% of human existence, our ancestors lived in small bands, moving with the seasons, taking what the land offered and leaving little trace of their passage. The world was vast, resources were abundant relative to population, and the idea of permanence, of building something meant to last for generations, hadn't yet taken hold in the human imagination. But then something extraordinary happened. Around 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, in a thin band of land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, people began to settle. The reasons are still debated by archaeologists. Climate change at the end of the last ice age made the region more hospitable. The development of agriculture allowed populations to produce surplus food for the first time. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was revolutionary. Humanity began to gather in permanent settlements. The first chapter takes us to Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, around 7,400 BCE. Imagine, if you will, a settlement unlike anything that had existed before. 9,000 people, perhaps more, living in mud brick houses so tightly packed together that there were no streets. People entered their homes through holes in the roofs, walking across the tops of buildings to reach their dwellings. Inside, the floors were made of plaster, decorated with paintings of animals and geometric patterns. The dead were buried beneath the floors, their bones excavated and circulated among the living in rituals we can only partially reconstruct. Çatalhöyük wasn't a city in the sense we understand the term. There's no evidence of central government, no palace or temple dominating the settlement, no clear hierarchy. But it was a concentration of humanity on a scale never before attempted, and with that concentration came the first urban challenges. The settlement needed water, vast amounts of it, drawn from nearby rivers and springs. It needed food, more than the immediate surroundings could provide through hunting and gathering alone. The inhabitants cultivated wheat and barley, domesticated sheep and cattle, created a system of production and distribution that could sustain thousands of people in close proximity. And they faced the first urban environmental crisis. The houses of Çatalhöyük had no windows, no doors at the ground level. Archaeologists believe this was partly defensive, but also practical. The streets between buildings, had they existed, would have been filled with waste, human and animal refuse, garbage, the byproducts of concentrated human life. The solution was to build upward, each generation constructing new houses on top of the ruins of the old, creating an artificial mound that rose higher with each passing century. Over 1,400 years, the settlement grew vertically, a tell that reached more than 20 meters in height, layer after layer of human habitation pressing down on the past. By 5800 BCE, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. The reasons remain unclear. Climate change, perhaps? Resource depletion? Social collapse? Or maybe simply the recognition that the settlement had grown beyond what the local environment could sustainably support. The people dispersed, and the mud brick houses slowly eroded back into the earth. But the impulse to build, to gather, to create permanent settlements that could house thousands didn't die with Çatalhöyük. It spread. Moving forward through time, our story takes us to Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. Here, in the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humanity created the world's first true cities. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, names that echo through history with the weight of civilization's birth. These weren't mere settlements. They were planned urban centers with monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies, specialized labor, and most importantly, writing. The invention of cuneiform script around 3400 BCE allowed the Sumerians to record their history, their laws, their economic transactions, their myths. For the first time, cities became self-aware, capable of reflecting on their own existence. The scale of Sumerian ambition was staggering. Uruk, at its height around 2900 BCE, covered more than 6 square kilometers and housed between 40 and 50,000 people. The city was dominated by the Iana and Anu ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that reached towards the sky, proclaiming humanity's ability to reshape the earth itself. The walls of Uruk, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, stretched for nearly 10 kilometers, constructed of mud brick and baked brick, a barrier against the chaos of the world beyond. But building these cities required resources on an unprecedented scale. The alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia had rich soil, deposited by annual floods that fertilized the land. But it had no stone, no timber, no metal. Everything had to be imported from distant regions: cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, copper from Anatolia and Arabia, stone from quarries hundreds of kilometers away. The Sumerians created the world's first long-distance trade networks, systems of exchange that linked their cities to resources across the ancient Near East. And they engineered the environment itself. The floods that made Sumerian agriculture possible also had destructive, unpredictable consequences, capable of washing away entire settlements. So the Sumerians built levees and canals, an irrigation system of astonishing complexity that channeled water from the rivers to fields kilometers away. They transformed the landscape, turning marshland into farmland, redirecting the flow of water to serve human purposes. This is where the pattern begins to emerge. Every ancient city faced the same fundamental challenge: how to sustain a large population in a small space. The solution was always the same: extract resources from a wider area, concentrate them in the urban center, and engineer the environment to maximize production. The Sumerians believed they had solved the problem. Their cities grew larger, their temples more elaborate, their trade networks more extensive. Cuneiform tablets from this period record an almost arrogant confidence in Sumerian civilization, a belief that they had achieved something permanent, that their cities would endure forever. But the shadow was already growing. The irrigation canals that made Sumerian agriculture possible had an unintended consequence. In the hot, dry climate of southern Mesopotamia, water evaporates rapidly. As it does, it leaves behind dissolved salts, trace minerals that accumulate in the soil over time. The Sumerians noticed the problem early. Tablets from around 2400 BCE record complaints about declining crop yields, about fields that once produced abundant wheat now struggling to grow barley, a more salt-tolerant crop. The process is called salinization, and it's devastatingly slow. Generation after generation, the salt content in the soil increased. The Sumerians tried to manage it, leaving fields fallow, digging new canals, praying to their gods for relief, but the mathematics were inexorable. By 2100 BCE, Sumerian crop yields in southern Mesopotamia had declined by nearly 65%. The cities that had dominated the region for a millennium began to collapse. Political power shifted north, to Akkad, and later to Babylon, regions where the irrigation systems were newer and the soil not yet exhausted. The cities of Sumer didn't disappear overnight. Some, like persisted for centuries, shadows of their former glory. But the civilization that had created writing, that had built the first great urban centers, slowly faded, and buried in the soil, invisible to the people who farmed the land, was the evidence of what had gone wrong. Layers of salt, the accumulated consequence of engineering ambition. The third chapter brings us across the world to the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India around 2600 BCE. Here, a civilization emerged that, in many ways, surpassed even the Sumerians in urban planning and engineering. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the two largest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, were marvels of organization. Unlike the organic, chaotic growth of Mesopotamian cities, the Indus cities were planned from the beginning. Streets laid out in precise grids, buildings constructed of uniform baked bricks, sophisticated sewage systems that channeled waste out of the city through covered drains. Mohenjo-Daro, excavated extensively in the 20th century, reveals a city of extraordinary sophistication. Nearly every house had access to water through wells or a public water supply. Private bathrooms with drainage connected to the city's sewage system. The famous Great Bath, a large public bathing pool lined with waterproof bitumen, suggests a culture that valued cleanliness and perhaps ritualistic purification. The city's warehouses, greeneries, and standardized weights and measures indicate a highly organized economy capable of storing and distributing resources with remarkable efficiency. The population of Mohenjo-Daro at its height may have reached 40,000, spread across an area of more than 300 hectares. The city sat near the Indus River, which provided water for drinking, irrigation, and transportation. Trade networks extended across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, to Mesopotamia, to the Persian Gulf, to Central Asia. Seals from the Indus Valley have been found in Sumerian cities, evidence of commercial exchange across thousands of kilometers. But here's what haunts archaeologists about the Indus Valley civilization. We still can't read their script. The symbols carved onto seals and pottery remain undeciphered, despite decades of effort. We don't know what they called themselves, what their political structure was, what gods they worshipped, or what they thought about their cities. The Indus Valley civilization is a ghost, magnificent and inscrutable. What we do know is that around 1900 BCE, the cities began to decline. Mohenjo-Daro shows evidence of flooding in its later phases, layers of silt deposited by the Indus River overwhelming the city's defenses. Some archaeologists believe the river changed course, perhaps due to tectonic activity or climate shifts, cutting the city off from its water supply or making its location untenable. Others point to evidence of desiccation, a drying climate that would have stressed the agricultural systems supporting the cities. Whatever the cause, the urban centers of the Indus Valley were gradually abandoned. There's no evidence of invasion, no burned layers indicating warfare, no mass graves suggesting epidemic. The people simply left, dispersing into smaller settlements, abandoning the cities that have been the center of their civilization for nearly 700 years. By 1300 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro was a ghost town, slowly being buried by the shifting sands and silt of the Indus River plain. The pattern repeats. A civilization rises, builds magnificent cities, engineers the environment to support urban populations, and then faces consequences that undermine the very foundations of urban life. Water, always water. Too much, too little, or poisoned by the waste of human activity. Our journey now takes us across another ocean, to Mesoamerica, where a series of civilizations built cities in the tropical forests and highlands of what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The Maya are perhaps the most famous, but they were preceded by the Olmec and followed by the Aztec, each building on the achievements and failures of those who came before. Tikal in the Petén Basin of northern Guatemala was one of the greatest Maya cities, reaching its peak between 600 and 800 CE. The city's population may have approached 100,000, an astonishing concentration of humanity in the middle of a tropical rainforest. The city's center was dominated by massive pyramids, temples rising more than 60 meters above the forest floor, visible for kilometers across the canopy. The rulers of Tikal proclaimed their power through architecture, through carved stone monuments called steles that recorded their victories, their divine ancestry, their mastery over the natural and spiritual worlds. But sustaining such a city in the rainforest required solving problems that would have baffled the Mesopotamians. The Maya had no rivers near their major cities, no natural water sources capable of supporting large populations. So they engineered an elaborate system of reservoirs, channels, and cisterns to capture and store rainwater during the wet season, ensuring supply through the dry months. The limestone bedrock of the Yucatan Peninsula is porous, allowing water to seep through quickly. So the Maya plastered their reservoirs with lime stucco to create waterproof surfaces. It was a triumph of ingenuity. And it required clearing the forest. Trees had to be cut for construction, for fuel to fire the kilns that produced the lime stucco, for creating agricultural land to feed the growing population. The Maya practiced what archaeologists call slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing forest patches, planting crops for a few years until the soil was exhausted, then moving to a new area and allowing the forest to reclaim the old fields. It's a sustainable practice at low population densities, allowing the forest to regenerate. But at the population levels Tikal reached, sustainability became impossible. Pollen analysis from lake cores near Maya cities reveals a stark transformation of the landscape. Between 700 and 800 CE, the forest around Tikal was almost entirely cleared. The diversity of tree species declined dramatically, replaced by agricultural plants and secondary growth. Soil erosion increased, washing sediment into the reservoirs and reducing their capacity. And the local climate began to change. Forests create their own weather patterns, recycling moisture through evapotranspiration. Remove the forest, dry seasons lengthen. The entire hydrological cycle shifts. The Maya didn't realize what they were doing. How could they? The changes happened over generations, slowly enough that no single person could perceive the pattern. Each generation inherited a slightly more stressed environment, but also a cultural expectation that the city would continue, that the rulers would provide, that the gods would ensure prosperity. And then the drought came. Paleoclimate data from cave formations and lake sediments show a series of severe drought in the Maya region between 800 and 1000 CE. These weren't unusual in the absolute sense. Droughts had happened before, but the Maya cities had stripped away the environmental buffers that might have allowed them to survive. The deforested landscape couldn't retain moisture. The reservoirs, clogged with sediment, couldn't store enough water. The agricultural systems, already pushed to their limits, collapsed. Tikal was abandoned by 900 CE. The Great Pyramid stood empty, the plazas silent. The royal dynasties that had ruled for centuries vanished. The collapse of classic Maya civilization is one of the most dramatic in history. Within a century, cities that had housed millions were deserted. The population of the Maya lowlands declined by 90%. The forest slowly reclaimed the cities, roots cracking stone monuments, trees growing from the tops of pyramids, erasing the evidence of human ambition. But the Maya themselves didn't disappear. They dispersed into smaller settlements, returned to agricultural patterns that could sustain smaller populations, rebuilt their society in a different form. The civilization collapsed, but the people endured. This is worth remembering. Cities can die, while populations survive. The question is always what is lost in the transition. Moving forward through time and space, we arrive at Angkor in what is now Cambodia, around 800 CE. The Khmer Empire built a city that, at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, may have been the largest pre-industrial urban center in the world. Angkor covered more than 1,000 square kilometers, an urban complex of staggering scale, centered around the magnificent Temple of Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed. The Khmer solved the water problem differently than the Maya. Cambodia has abundant water during the monsoon season. Too much water, in fact. The challenge was storing it for the dry season and preventing destructive flooding. So the Khmer built a hydraulic city, a network of reservoirs called barays, canals, and moats that served multiple purposes: water storage, irrigation, transportation, flood control, and symbolic representation of the Hindu cosmos. The West Baray, completed in the 11th century, measures 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers and could hold more than 50 million cubic meters of water. It was fed by a canal that diverted water from the Siem Reap River, a feat of engineering that required moving millions of cubic meters of earth. The system worked for centuries. Angkor's population grew to perhaps 700,000 to 1 million people, sustained by intensive rice agriculture that could produce 2 or 3 harvests per year. The city became the center of an empire that dominated mainland Southeast Asia, its power expressed through monumental architecture that still astonishes visitors today. But the hydraulic system was fragile in ways the Khmer didn't fully appreciate. The network of canals and reservoirs required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated, reducing capacity. Wooden channels and gates rotted and needed replacement. As the system expanded, it became more complex, more interconnected, more vulnerable to cascading failures. And the environmental stress was mounting. Deforestation around Angkor for construction and agriculture destabilized watersheds. Soil erosion increased, clogging the canals with sediment at an accelerating rate. Recent research using laser scanning technology called LiDAR has revealed the full extent of Angkor's urban sprawl. Beneath the forest canopy, invisible to traditional archaeological methods, are the remains of a vast, low-density urban landscape, with houses, roads, ponds, and agricultural features extending for kilometers beyond the temple complexes. The city was much larger than anyone realized, and that meant the environmental demands were correspondingly greater. Climate records from tree rings and cave formations show that the 14th and 15th centuries brought a series of extreme weather events to Southeast Asia. Mega droughts, followed by intense monsoons and flooding. The hydraulic system at Angkor couldn't cope with such extremes. Droughts left the reservoirs dry, undermining food production. Floods breached the levees, damaged infrastructure, washed away the carefully constructed channels. The Khmer tried to adapt, building new canals, modifying the system, but the maintenance demands exceeded their capacity. By the early 14th century, Angkor was in terminal decline. The capital was moved to Phnom Penh, a location with easier access to maritime trade and less dependent on complex hydraulic engineering. Angkor itself wasn't entirely abandoned. It remained a religious site, and small populations continued to live in the area. But the great city, the urban complex that had dominated the region for 6 centuries, effectively died. The temples remained, of course. Stone endures longer than wood and earth. Angkor Wat, surrounded by its moat, was protected from the worst of the forest's encroachment. But the hydraulic city, the network of barrays and canals that had made Angkor possible, slowly filled with sediment, was choked by vegetation, dissolved back into the landscape. By the 19th century, when European explorers rediscovered Angkor, the jungle had swallowed almost everything except the stone temples. The city had become a legend, a mysterious ruin in the forest, its true size and complexity hidden until satellites and LiDAR revealed the ghost beneath the trees. But then something changed. The pattern we've been tracing, the rise and fall of ancient cities overwhelmed by environmental stress and engineering hubris, should have served as a warning to future civilizations. Should have, but largely didn't. Because the knowledge was buried, literally and figuratively. The cities of Sumer, the Indus Valley, the Maya, and Angkor became archaeological sites, puzzles for scholars to piece together. The lessons they offered were forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant to modern circumstances. The world would never be the same after the Industrial Revolution. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, humanity acquired access to new forms of energy. First coal, then oil and natural gas, that broke the constraints that had limited urban growth for millennia. Suddenly, cities could grow beyond what the immediate hinterland could support. Food could be transported hundreds or thousands of kilometers by rail and steamship. Water could be pumped from deep aquifers or piped across vast distances. The population that agriculture could support was no longer determined by local conditions, but by the reach of industrial systems. London in 1800 was the largest city in Europe, with a population approaching 1 million. By 1900, it had grown to more than 6 million. New York, a small port town of 33,000 in 1800, reached more than 3 million by 1900. Chicago, which barely existed in 1800, grew to over 1.5 million. Cities exploded in size at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to anyone living in previous centuries. The second chapter reveals how this transformation was made possible through a series of technological and social innovations, each building on the last, each enabling further urban growth. The first was the expansion of agricultural productivity. New crops from the Americas, potatoes, maize, tomatoes, spread across the world, providing more calories per hectare than traditional grains. New farming techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding, and eventually chemical fertilizers increased yields. The percentage of the population needed to farm declined, freeing labor for urban industries and services. The second innovation was transportation. Railroads, invented in the 1820s, allowed cities to draw resources from continental-scale hinterlands. Chicago became the rail hub of North America, connecting the agricultural heartland to the eastern cities and ports. Grain, meat, and other foodstuffs flowed through Chicago by the trainload, feeding millions who had never set foot on a farm. The same process occurred in Europe, in Asia, everywhere railroads reached. Cities became nodes in networks of extraction and distribution, divorcing urban prosperity from local environmental limits. The third innovation was sanitation. The diseases that had ravaged urban populations for centuries, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, were finally understood to be waterborne, spread through contaminated water supplies. Cities invested in massive infrastructure projects, water systems to bring clean water from distant sources, sewer systems to remove waste. London's sewer system, constructed in the 1960s after the Great Stink of 1858 made the Thames River unbearably foul, was a marvel of Victorian engineering. Over 2,000 kilometers of sewers, carrying waste away from the city to treatment facilities downstream. Similar systems were built in Paris, New York, Berlin, every growing industrial city. These innovations created an optimism, a belief that humanity had finally solved the urban problem. Cities could grow indefinitely, or so it seemed, as long as engineering kept pace with expansion. The problems that had destroyed Sumer and the Maya appeared to be relics of a less advanced age, when people lacked the scientific and industrial capacity to properly manage their environment. But this triumph had a shadow. Even as industrial cities grew, the environmental and social costs were mounting in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for decades. Moving into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities became centers of industrial production on an unprecedented scale. Factories, powered by coal and increasingly by oil, produced goods in quantities that dwarfed anything possible under manual labor. Steel mills, textile factories, meatpacking plants, chemical works, entire urban economies were built around industrial production. The wealth generated was staggering, creating a class of industrialists and financiers whose fortunes would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. But the environmental cost was equally staggering. Industrial cities were catastrophically polluted. The air was thick with smoke from coal fires, turning skies gray and reducing visibility to meters on bad days. In London, the combination of fog and coal smoke created pea soup fogs, dense yellow-black clouds that shut down the city for days, sickening and killing thousands. The rivers that ran through industrial cities became open sewers, filled not just with human waste, but with industrial effluents, dyes, heavy metals, acids, organic solvents that killed all aquatic life and rendered the water unfit for any use.
Pittsburgh, the steel capital of the United States, was so polluted in the early 20th century that streetlights had to remain on during the day. Residents changed shirts twice a day because the collar would be black with soot by noon. The Monongahela River, which runs through the city, was essentially biologically dead, poisoned by industrial waste. And yet, Pittsburgh was prosperous, a symbol of American industrial might, the city that forged the steel that built skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads across the continent. The human cost was equally severe. Industrial cities were plagued by overcrowding, disease, and inequality on a scale that shocked contemporary observers. Workers lived in tenements, cramped apartments with minimal sanitation, sometimes sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough beds. Child labor was common, with children as young as 6 working in factories, mines, and mills for 12 hours a day. Industrial accidents were frequent and often deadly, with workers having no legal recourse against employers. The contrast between the wealth of the industrialists and the poverty of the workers created social tensions that exploded into labor movements, strikes, and occasionally violence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw repeated confrontations between workers and owners, mediated by state power that usually sided with capital. The Pullman strike of 1894 in Chicago, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in 1911, the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in 1914. These events revealed the dark underside of industrial prosperity, the human lives consumed by the engine of urban growth. But the dominant narrative was progress. Cities were growing, wealth was increasing, life expectancy was rising as sanitation improved and medicine advanced. The problems, pollution, inequality, labor exploitation, were seen as temporary, things that would be solved as society became more enlightened and prosperous. The assumption was that the trajectory was upward, that each generation would inherit a better, richer, more advanced world than the last. The first half of the 20th century seemed to confirm this optimism, at least in fits and starts. Cities continued to grow, spreading outward as new transportation technologies, electric streetcars, automobiles, and subways, allowed people to live farther from their workplaces. The metropolis emerged, a new form of urban organization characterized by a dense central core surrounded by sprawling suburbs. Los Angeles pioneered this model in the United States, a city that grew horizontally rather than vertically, consuming vast tracts of land and creating a car-dependent culture that would be replicated across the world. Skyscrapers, made possible by steel frame construction and electric elevators, allowed cities to grow vertically as well. New York's skyline became iconic, a symbol of American economic power and technological prowess. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931 during the Great Depression, rose 381 meters, the tallest building in the world for nearly 40 years. It was a defiant statement of confidence, built during a time of economic collapse, proclaiming that the city would endure and prosper. But beneath the gleaming facades, the patterns of ancient cities were reasserting themselves. Urban growth required resources, water, energy, food, raw materials, extracted from ever wider hinterlands. Los Angeles, growing in a semi-arid region, began importing water from the Owens Valley more than 200 kilometers away, draining the valley dry and creating what locals called the second rape of California after the environmental destruction of the gold rush. The city's growth was enabled by appropriating the water resources of distant regions, a strategy that created prosperity in Los Angeles but devastation elsewhere. New York faced its own water crisis. The city's population reached 7 million by 1940, far exceeding the capacity of local water sources. The solution was the same as in Los Angeles: reach farther afield. New York built a series of reservoirs in the Catskill Mountains, more than 100 kilometers north of the city, flooding entire valleys and displacing thousands of residents to ensure that the city's taps kept flowing. The system worked, delivering more than 1 billion gallons of water to New York each day, but it was a band-aid, not a solution. The city's growth continued to outpace the water supply, requiring ever more reservoirs, ever more distant sources. The energy demands of industrial cities were equally voracious. By the mid-20th century, cities consumed enormous quantities of coal, oil, and natural gas for heating, electricity, and transportation. The power plants that supplied electricity were often located within the cities themselves, belching smoke and pollutants directly into urban atmospheres. The air quality in industrial cities was among the worst in human history, creating health crises that wouldn't be fully recognized until decades later. And then came the automobile. In the post-World War II era, particularly in the United States, the car became not just a mode of transportation, but a symbol of freedom and prosperity. Cities were redesigned around the automobile, with wide highways cutting through urban neighborhoods, vast parking lots consuming downtown land, and suburban sprawl expanding at an accelerating rate. The consequences were profound and largely unforeseen. Cities became more spread out, more dependent on fossil fuels, more segregated by race and class. Public transportation systems were allowed to decay as investment shifted to highways. Walkable neighborhoods were demolished to make way for expressways. The construction of the interstate highway system in the United States, beginning in 1956, was the largest public works project in history. 76,000 kilometers of limited access highways connecting cities across the continent, enabling the flow of goods and people at unprecedented speed. But the highways also destroyed urban neighborhoods, disproportionately targeting communities of color through a process that later became known as urban renewal. Entire districts were bulldozed, their residents displaced to make way for the highways that would allow suburban commuters to drive into and out of the city. Cities became fragmented, divided by rivers of concrete and asphalt that were almost impossible to cross on foot. By the 1960s, the environmental and social costs of this model were becoming impossible to ignore. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, awakened public consciousness to the dangers of industrial pollution, particularly pesticides that were accumulating in ecosystems and causing widespread ecological damage. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, so polluted with industrial waste that it caught fire multiple times, most famously in 1969, became a symbol of environmental degradation.
The first Earth Day, celebrated in 1970, drew millions of Americans and helped launch the modern environmental movement. Cities began to recognize that they couldn't continue on the same trajectory. Pollution controls were implemented, cleaner energy sources were pursued, and some effort was made to mitigate the worst environmental damages. The Clean Air Act and Water Act in the United States, both passed in the 1970s, set standards for pollution and required industries to reduce their emissions. Similar legislation was enacted in Europe and Japan. The air quality in cities improved dramatically over the following decades, and some rivers that had been declared biologically dead began to recover. But the fundamental model of urban development didn't change. Cities continued to grow, continued to sprawl, continued to depend on resources extracted from distant regions and imported through complex supply chains. The difference was that the environmental costs were being exported, pushed to the periphery, made invisible to urban residents who benefited from the system. What happened next would shock the world. Not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual realization that the urban model developed in the industrial era wasn't sustainable, that the limits were approaching faster than anyone had anticipated, that the environmental buffers that had allowed cities to grow were being stripped away, just as they had been in Sumer, in the Maya lowlands, at Angkor. Climate change emerged as a defining environmental challenge of the late 20th century and early 21st century. The burning of fossil fuels, the very energy source that had enabled industrial urban growth, was altering the planet's climate system. Global temperatures were rising, weather patterns were becoming more extreme, sea levels were increasing, ice sheets were melting, and cities, the engines of fossil fuel consumption, were both the primary cause of climate change and the most vulnerable to its effects. Consider Miami, a city built on drained wetlands at the south end of Florida, barely 2 meters above sea level at its highest point. Miami's growth in the 20th century was enabled by air conditioning, which made the subtropical climate tolerable, and by massive drainage projects that converted the Everglades from a vast wetland into developable land. By 2000, the Miami metropolitan area had a population of more than 5 million, a tourist destination and financial hub with a skyline that rivaled any city in the world. But Miami is sinking. Or rather, the ocean is rising. Sea levels off the coast of Florida have increased by more than 20 centimeters since 1900 and are accelerating. By 2050, even under moderate climate scenarios, sea levels could rise another 30 to 60 centimeters. That doesn't sound like much, but for a city as low-lying as Miami, it's potentially catastrophic. High tides already flood streets in Miami Beach and other coastal neighborhoods. Storm surges from hurricanes, which are becoming more intense as ocean temperatures rise, can push water meters above normal levels, inundating vast areas. The city has invested billions in adaptation measures, raising streets, installing pumps to remove floodwater, building seawalls. But these are temporary fixes. The underlying problem is that the city was built in a location that's becoming increasingly uninhabitable as the climate changes. The porous limestone bedrock of South Florida means that seawalls are largely ineffective. The water simply seeps through from below. Some neighborhoods are already experiencing sunny day flooding, where high tides cause water to bubble up through storm drains and flood streets, even when there's no storm. And yet, development continues. New high-rises are being built along the coast, marketed to wealthy buyers who seem willing to ignore the long-term risks. The city's economy depends on real estate and tourism, both of which would collapse if the population faced the reality that Miami may be largely underwater by the end of the century. There's a collective denial, a belief that technology or engineering will solve the problem, that what's happening to Miami is temporary or manageable. The parallel to ancient cities is striking. The Maya saw the forests receding, the reservoirs filling with sediment, the crop yields declining, and yet the rulers continued to build temples, to proclaim their divine authority, to believe that their civilization would endure. The evidence of decline was everywhere, but acknowledging it would have meant confronting the failure of the entire system, so they continued until they couldn't. Moving across the Pacific, consider Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, a megacity of more than 10 million people in the urban core and more than 30 million in the greater metropolitan area. Jakarta is sinking faster than any other major city in the world, dropping by as much as 25 centimeters per year in some areas. The cause isn't primarily sea level rise, though that's contributing. The cause is groundwater extraction. Jakarta sits on the Java coastal plain, a low-lying area crisscrossed by rivers and prone to flooding. The city's formal water supply system is inadequate, serving less than half the population, so residents and businesses drill private wells, extracting groundwater from the aquifer beneath the city. As the water is removed, the ground above compresses and sinks, a process called subsidence. The northern part of Jakarta, which includes the port and much of the old city, has sunk by more than 4 meters since 1970. The consequences are severe and worsening. Seawater is intruding into the aquifer, contaminating the fresh water and forcing wells to be drilled deeper, which accelerates the subsidence. Buildings are cracking and collapsing as the ground beneath them shifts. Flood walls built to protect the city are now below sea level, rendering them ineffective. During the wet season, large areas of Jakarta are underwater, the drainage systems overwhelmed by the combination of heavy rainfall, sinking land, and rising seas. The Indonesian government has proposed a solution so ambitious it seems almost fantastical. Abandon Jakarta as the capital and build a new city on the island of Borneo. The project, announced in 2019, would involve relocating the entire national government to a purpose-built capital named Nusantara, at a cost estimated at more than $30 billion. It's a tacit admission that Jakarta's problems are insoluble, that the city was built in a place and in a manner that can't be sustained. But will the new capital be different? Or will it simply repeat the same patterns, extracting resources from a wider area, engineering the environment to support a concentrated population, creating vulnerabilities that won't be apparent until decades later when the infrastructure has decayed and the environmental buffers have been stripped away? These are not isolated examples. Cities around the world are facing similar crises, manifestations of the same fundamental problem. Urban growth has outstripped the capacity of the environment to sustainably support it. How did this happen? How did we build cities that we knew, or should have known, were vulnerable to the very environmental conditions that destroyed ancient civilizations? The answer lies in a combination of short-term thinking, economic incentives, political structures, and simple human psychology. Cities grow because growth generates wealth. Development creates jobs, increases property values, expands the tax base, and attracts investment. For city governments, developers, and businesses, growth is prosperity. The incentive is always to approve new construction, to extend infrastructure to new areas, to welcome population increase. The costs of growth, environmental degradation, infrastructure strain, increased vulnerability to disasters, are often not apparent for years or decades, long before the decisions have been made and the profits have been taken. Consider the sprawl that characterizes most American cities. Developers build subdivisions on the urban fringe because land is cheap and buyers want affordable housing. Municipalities annex these areas because they expand the tax base. Residents move there seeking space, lower costs, and the perceived higher quality of life. The cycle repeats, pushing the urban boundary farther and farther outward. But sprawl is enormously expensive to maintain. The infrastructure, roads, water pipes, sewer lines, power grids, serving low-density suburbs costs far more per person than the infrastructure in dense urban cores. As the infrastructure ages, maintenance costs escalate. The tax revenue from suburban development often doesn't cover the long-term costs, creating a financial burden that municipalities struggle to manage. But by the time the problem becomes apparent, the subdivisions have been built, the residents have moved in, and there's no politically feasible way to reverse course. The same dynamic applies to environmental costs. Building cities in floodplains, in deserts, in seismically active zones, or on coastlines vulnerable to storms and sea level rise creates risks that won't materialize for years. During that time, the city grows, investments are made, the economy becomes dependent on continued growth. When the risks do materialize, a major flood, an earthquake, a water shortage, the response is usually to engineer a solution rather than question the fundamental wisdom of the city's location or growth pattern. Build higher levees, stricter building codes, more distant water sources. The pattern repeats, each solution creating new vulnerabilities, postponing but not eliminating the eventual reckoning. Why didn't anyone stop it? The honest answer is that many people tried. Environmental activists, scientists, urban planners, and concerned citizens have been warning about the unsustainability of modern urban development for decades. Reports have been published, data has been presented, models have been run showing the trajectories of resource depletion, pollution, and climate change. The information has been available, often in painful detail. But warnings compete with powerful opposing forces, economic interests that profit from growth, political structures that reward short-term results over long-term planning, cultural narratives that equate growth with success and stagnation with failure, and perhaps most fundamentally, the difficulty humans have in responding to slow-moving threats. We're evolved to respond to immediate dangers, a predator, a fire, a flood. We're not well equipped to respond to dangers that unfold over decades, that result from millions of individual decisions, that can't be addressed by any single person or organization. The data has been screaming. Climate scientists have been warning since the 1980s that fossil fuel emissions are warming the planet, that the consequences will be severe, that action needs to be taken immediately to avoid catastrophic outcomes. Urban planners have documented the costs and risks of sprawl, the vulnerabilities of cities to natural disasters, the unsustainability of current resource consumption patterns. Hydrologists have warned that aquifers are being depleted faster than they're recharging, that river systems are being overallocated, that cities are facing water crises within decades. And the response, broadly speaking, has been incremental adjustments rather than fundamental change. Fuel efficiency standards for cars, but continued dependence on automobiles, renewable energy investments, but continued construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, building codes that make structures more resilient, but continued development in vulnerable areas. Each measure addresses a symptom without confronting the underlying problem. We've built an urban model that requires unsustainable resource extraction and generates environmental degradation faster than ecosystems can recover. The economic imperative overwhelms long-term survival calculations. Cities exist within national and global economic systems that demand growth. A city that stops growing is perceived as declining, losing population and investment to more dynamic competitors. The political pressure is always to facilitate development, to attract businesses, to increase housing supply. Long-term sustainability is a goal expressed in planning documents and mayoral speeches, but it's subordinate to the immediate need to create jobs and generate tax revenue. This is particularly acute in developing countries, where hundreds of millions of people are moving from rural areas to cities in search of economic opportunity. China's urbanization, beginning in earnest in the 1980s and accelerating through the first decades of the 21st century, is the largest and fastest in history. Between 1990 and 2020, China's urban population increased by more than 500 million people. Cities like Shenzhen grew from small towns to megacities, with populations exceeding 10 million in the span of a few decades. The scale of construction required to accommodate this growth is almost incomprehensible. Entire cities built from scratch, hundreds of skyscrapers rising simultaneously, subway systems and highway networks constructed in years rather than decades. The environmental cost has been equally staggering. China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest consumer of coal, and struggles with severe air pollution in many urban areas. The rapid urbanization has created prosperity for hundreds of millions of people, lifting them from poverty into the middle class. But it has also created vulnerabilities that China is only beginning to confront. The unthinkable is becoming inevitable. The black swan events that urban planners and disaster specialists warn about, events that seem improbable but have catastrophic consequences, are occurring with increasing frequency. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which flooded New Orleans and killed more than 1,800 people, exposed the vulnerability of American cities to natural disasters and the failure of infrastructure to provide protection. The Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, triggered by an earthquake and tsunami that exceeded the design parameters of the power plant, demonstrated the fragility of complex technological systems. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2019, shut down cities across the world, revealing how dependent urban life is on global supply chains and how quickly systems can collapse when disrupted. Each of these events was, in hindsight, predictable. New Orleans was known to be vulnerable to hurricanes, built in a bowl below sea level and protected by levees that engineers had warned were inadequate. Fukushima was built in a seismically active zone, and the possibility of a tsunami exceeding the seawall's height had been discussed, though dismissed as unlikely enough to ignore. Pandemics are recurring features of human history, and public health experts had been warning for years that global connectivity and urban density created ideal conditions for a respiratory virus to spread rapidly. But in each case, the measures needed to prevent or significantly mitigate the disaster weren't taken. The costs seemed too high, the probability too low, the political will absent, until the disaster occurred and the costs were vastly higher than prevention would have been. As we approach the modern age, the pattern of ancient cities becomes impossible to ignore. We are living through a period of unprecedented urban growth, with more than half of humanity now concentrated in cities. These cities are magnificent, yes, but they are also fragile, dependent on systems of resource extraction and environmental manipulation that are straining against planetary limits. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen the rise of megacities, urban areas with populations exceeding 10 million. Tokyo, Delhi, Shanghai, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Cairo, Mumbai, Beijing, Dhaka, Osaka. These cities house tens of millions of people each, concentrations of humanity that would have been unimaginable in any previous era. They are centers of economic activity, culture, innovation, and political power. They are also centers of pollution, inequality, and vulnerability. Take Delhi, the capital of India, with a metropolitan population approaching 30 million. Delhi is one of the most polluted cities in the world, with air quality that regularly reaches hazardous levels. During the winter months, a toxic smog blankets the city, a combination of vehicle emissions, industrial pollution, crop burning in surrounding states, and dust. Visibility drops to meters. Flights are canceled, schools are closed, and hospitals overflow with patients suffering respiratory distress. The pollution is so severe that living in Delhi is estimated to reduce life expectancy by more than 10 years compared to breathing clean air. And yet, Delhi continues to grow. The pollution is acknowledged, measures are taken, vehicle restrictions, industrial regulations, attempts to reduce crop burning, but they're insufficient to address the scale of the problem. The city's economy depends on continued growth, on attracting businesses and residents, on maintaining its position as India's political and economic capital. The pollution is the cost, and it's a cost that the most vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, children, disproportionately bear. Delhi also faces a water crisis. The city's demand for water far exceeds the supply from the Yamuna River and other local sources. Groundwater is being extracted at unsustainable rates, with the water table dropping by several meters per decade. During the summer, parts of the city experience severe water shortages, with residents waiting in line for hours to fill containers from tanker trucks. The city has explored importing water from more distant sources, building canals and aqueducts to bring water from neighboring states, but the demand continues to outpace supply, and the long-term trajectory is unsustainable. The story is repeated in cities across the developing world. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is one of the fastest-growing megacities, with a population approaching 20 million packed into an area prone to flooding. Much of the city is built on low-lying land crisscrossed by rivers that overflow during the monsoon season. Climate change is increasing the intensity and frequency of floods, while the city continues to expand, paving over wetlands and natural drainage areas that once absorbed excess water. The result is regular and increasingly severe flooding, with large areas of the city underwater for weeks at a time. Cairo, built along the Nile River, depends entirely on the river for its water supply, but the Nile is over-allocated, with Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia all competing for the river's water. Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam, the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa, has created tensions with Egypt, which fears that the dam will reduce the flow of the Nile and threaten its water security. Cairo's population, already more than 20 million and still growing, faces the prospect of water shortages that could destabilize the entire region. In the developed world, the challenges are different but no less severe. Cities like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix, built in arid regions of the American Southwest, depend on the Colorado River for water. The river is over-allocated, with more water claimed by users than the river actually carries in an average year. The deficit has been covered by drawing down reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, but those reservoirs are now at historically low levels, approaching the point where they can't generate hydroelectric power or supply water to downstream users. The cities face the prospect of mandatory water rationing, restrictions that could undermine their economies and quality of life. The electrical grids that power modern cities are similarly strained. In California, the combination of aging infrastructure, increasing demand, and extreme weather has led to regular blackouts, either from wildfires caused by power lines or from controlled shutoffs to prevent fires. In Texas, the winter storm of 2021 caused the state's electrical grid to collapse, leaving millions without power in freezing temperatures for days and killing hundreds. The grid had been designed for hot summers, not for extreme cold, and lacked the redundancy and winterization that would have prevented the failure. These are cascading failures, where one system's collapse triggers another's. The power outage in Texas shut down water treatment plants, leaving millions without safe drinking water. It closed hospitals and nursing homes, creating humanitarian crises. It shut down natural gas production, which reduced the supply of gas to power plants, worsening the power shortage. The interconnectedness that makes modern cities so efficient in normal times makes them catastrophically vulnerable when disruptions occur. Climate change is exacerbating all of these vulnerabilities. Heat waves are becoming more frequent and intense, straining electrical grids as air conditioning use spikes. Droughts are lasting longer, reducing water supplies and increasing wildfire risk. Storms are intensifying, overwhelming drainage systems and flood defenses. Sea level rise is threatening coastal cities, not just with inundation, but with saltwater intrusion into aquifers and the loss of protective wetlands. The delicate dance of modern urban systems, power grids, supply chains, digital networks, is becoming more precarious. Cities function because of an intricate web of dependencies, each system relying on others to function. When those interdependencies are disrupted, the cascade can be swift and devastating. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of the Atlantis Effect. The pattern that destroyed Sumer, the megacities, and Angkor is not a relic of the past. It's an ongoing process, playing out in slow motion across the world's cities. We are living inside the greatest urban experiment in human history, building cities larger, more complex, and more resource-intensive than anything that came before. And we are doing so in an era when the environmental and climatic conditions that have supported human civilization for the past 10,000 years are changing rapidly. The question is no longer whether modern cities are repeating the patterns of ancient doomed cities. They clearly are. The question is whether we can recognize the pattern in time and change course. Whether we can build cities that are resilient, that work with environmental systems rather than against them, that can adapt to the coming changes without collapsing. Some cities are trying. Copenhagen has invested heavily in cycling infrastructure, making bicycles the primary mode of transportation for more than half of residents, reducing emissions and improving air quality. Singapore has pioneered water management systems that capture every drop of rainfall, treat wastewater to potable standards, and even import water from neighboring Malaysia through pipelines and tankers, creating a diversified and resilient water supply. Medellin, Colombia, once one of the most dangerous cities in the world, transformed itself through investments in public transportation, parks and libraries in poor neighborhoods, demonstrating that social and environmental improvements can reinforce each other. These examples offer hope, but they're exceptions. The dominant pattern remains growth without adequate consideration of long-term sustainability, development without sufficient investment in resilience, short-term economic gains prioritized over long-term survival. The 21st century has seen the proliferation of smart city initiatives, the application of digital technology to urban management. Sensors monitor traffic, water use, air quality, energy consumption. Data analytics optimize everything from trash collection routes to building temperatures. The promise is that technology can make cities more efficient, more livable, more sustainable. But technology alone isn't sufficient. Smart cities are still vulnerable to resource depletion, to climate change, to the cascading failures that result from complexity. A smart city without adequate water supplies is still a city in crisis. A smart city on a coast threatened by sea level rise is still a city facing abandonment. The technology can help manage resources more efficiently, but it can't create resources that don't exist or reverse environmental degradation that's already occurred. What's needed is a paradigm shift, a fundamental rethinking of what cities are for and how they relate to the environment. For the past 2 centuries, the dominant model has treated nature as a resource to be exploited, an obstacle to be overcome through engineering. Cities have been built as if they're separate from nature, islands of human control surrounded by a world that can be endlessly mined for materials and used as a dump for waste. This model worked, for a time, because the scale of human activity was small relative to the planet. But that's no longer true. We've reached planetary scale. The carbon dioxide we emit is changing the global climate. The plastic we produce is accumulating in the oceans. The nitrogen we use in fertilizers is creating dead zones in coastal waters. The scale of urbanization is altering weather patterns, water cycles, and ecosystems at a continental level. Regenerative urban design offers an alternative vision. Rather than fighting against natural systems, regenerative design works with them. It sees cities as part of ecosystems, not separate from them. It treats waste as a resource, closing loops and eliminating pollution. It values biodiversity, green space, and natural processes not as amenities, but as essential infrastructure. Examples include green roofs and walls that absorb rainwater, reduce heat, and provide habitat for wildlife. Permeable pavements that allow water to soak into the ground rather than running off into storm sewers. urban forests that cool the air, filter pollutants, and sequester carbon. Wetlands that treat wastewater naturally and provide flood protection. These aren't decorative additions, but functional elements that make cities more resilient and sustainable. Decentralization is another key strategy. Modern cities are vulnerable because they depend on centralized systems, single power plants, single water treatment facilities, single supply chains that can fail catastrophically. Decentralizing these systems, creating redundancy and local capacity, reduces vulnerability. Solar panels on roofs and batteries in basements mean that a failure of the central grid doesn't leave entire neighborhoods without power. Rainwater harvesting and local water treatment reduce dependence on distant sources. Urban agriculture and farmers markets shorten supply chains and increase food security. Decentralization also has social benefits. It empowers communities to meet their own needs, reducing dependence on distant authorities and corporations. It builds social capital, the networks of trust and cooperation that help communities respond to crises. And it creates economic opportunities at the local level, keeping wealth circulating within communities rather than extracting it to distant centers. But perhaps the most important shift is cultural, redefining progress and prosperity. The dominant narrative equates progress with growth, larger cities, taller buildings, faster transportation, more consumption. Prosperity is measured by GDP, by property values, by the accumulation of material goods. This narrative drives the patterns that have made cities unsustainable. A different narrative is possible. Progress could mean increasing resilience, building systems that can withstand shocks and adapt to change. It could mean improving quality of life, measured not by consumption but by health, happiness, connection to community and nature. Prosperity could mean having enough, having security, having a livable environment for future generations rather than endless accumulation. This isn't utopian idealism. It's practical recognition that the current trajectory leads to collapse. The cities we're building today are creating the ruins that archaeologists will excavate in the future, if there are archaeologists. The question is whether those ruins will tell a story of societies that recognized the pattern and changed course, or of societies that repeated the mistakes of their predecessors until the end. The parallels are too stark to ignore. Sumer's irrigation systems that salted the soil, the Maya deforestation that destabilized the climate, Angkor's hydraulic city that collapsed when the monsoons failed. These aren't ancient history. They're prologue. They're warning signs that we've been too arrogant or too distracted to heed. But there's a difference, a possibility that didn't exist for ancient civilizations. We have the knowledge, the technology, and the global communication systems to understand the pattern and choose differently. We can see what happened to societies that pushed past environmental limits, that believed their engineering could overcome any obstacle, that prioritized short-term power and prosperity over long-term survival. We can learn from their ruins, if we're willing. The story of the Atlantis Effect isn't finished. It's being written right now, in the decisions being made in city halls and corporate boardrooms, in the choices of billions of individuals about how to live and what to consume. The ending isn't predetermined. We can repeat the pattern, build our cities into magnificent monuments that will one day be buried and forgotten, swallowed by rising seas, or reclaimed by forests, or abandoned as deserts. Or we can break the pattern, build cities that endure not by dominating nature, but by integrating with it. Cities that are resilient and adaptable. Cities that our descendants will inhabit rather than excavate. The ghost of Atlantis is real, not as a literal sunken city, but as a pattern, a cycle of ambition and hubris and collapse that has repeated throughout history. The question facing our generation is whether we have the wisdom to escape it, whether we can build something different, something that doesn't just rise higher but endures longer, something that doesn't just extract and consume but regenerates and sustains. The water is rising, literally and metaphorically. The droughts are lengthening. The storms are intensifying. The systems we depend on are straining toward failure.
The cities we've built are magnificent, but they're also fragile. They stand on foundations of sand, of depleted aquifers, of overtaxed resources, of climate systems we destabilized without fully understanding the consequences. In the ruins of ancient cities, archaeologists find evidence of the moment when collapse became inevitable. The layers of sediment choking the Sumerian canals, the evidence of deforestation around Maya temples, the silted-up reservoirs of Angkor. These are the physical traces of societies that crossed thresholds from which they couldn't return. What will archaeologists find when they excavate our cities? Will they find evidence that we recognize the pattern and changed course, or will they find the same familiar story played out at a larger scale with higher technology but the same fundamental failure to live within limits? The story continues, but the next chapter is ours to write. We inherit cities that consume more resources than the planet can sustainably provide, that generate waste faster than ecosystems can absorb, that concentrate vulnerability in places that are becoming increasingly uninhabitable. We inherit a climate that's changing in ways that will reshape coastlines, transform ecosystems, and challenge every assumption about where and how cities can exist. But we also inherit knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that came before, the scientific understanding of how ecosystems function and how they fail, the technological capacity to build differently if we choose. We inherit the possibility of learning from history rather than repeating it. The Atlantis Effect is not destiny. It's a warning, a pattern visible in the archaeological record and in the present moment, a cycle that can be broken if we have the courage to acknowledge it and the wisdom to choose differently. The cities of the future will either be monuments to our ability to learn and adapt, or they will be ruins, silent testimonies to humanity's inability to escape the patterns that have always led to collapse. The choice is being made now, in this moment, in these cities, by all of us living through the greatest urban experiment in history. The question isn't whether the pattern exists, the question is whether we're wise enough to escape it. The waves are rising, the storms are gathering, the systems are straining, and in the twilight of this age, as we stand in cities that tower toward the sky and stretch toward the horizon, we must ask ourselves, are we building a future or are we building ruins? Are we the generation that breaks the cycle or the generation that completes it? The story continues into a future we're creating with every choice, every building, every city we construct or abandon. The ghost of Atlantis watches, waiting to see if this time will be different, if this civilization will escape the pattern, or if we too will join the long line of societies that believed they were invincible until the moment they weren't. In the end, the cities we build reveal who we are. They show whether we value the present or the future, whether we live within limits or believe ourselves exempt from them, whether we learn from the past or dismiss it as irrelevant. The ruins of ancient cities offer their testimony, etched in stone and salt and sediment. Our cities will offer testimony as well, either to our wisdom or to our folly, to our ability to adapt or our failure to change. The final verdict isn't written. The experiment continues, and somewhere in the balance between ambition and humility, between progress and sustainability, between the hubris that builds cities and the wisdom that knows when to stop, lies the possibility of a different ending, a different legacy, a different future than the pattern would suggest. The night deepens, and the cities glow against the darkness, brilliant and fragile, magnificent and vulnerable. Monuments to human ambition and warnings of human limits. They stand for now, but the question remains, for how long? And when the archaeologists of distant futures excavate our ruins, what story will they read in the layers of our civilization? Will it be the familiar tale of collapse, or something new, something unprecedented? A civilization that finally learned to live within the limits of the planet that sustains it. The story continues, and we are all writing it together,
in the cities we build and the choices we make, in the legacy we leave and the future we create or destroy. The ghost of Atlantis is patient, eternal, waiting to claim another civilization or to be finally proven wrong by a species that learns, adapts, and endures.